Who are you? I mean, it seems like a really simple question, right? But what happens when the answer you've built your entire life on is suddenly just gone? Whether it's through the experience of war, losing a job, or even just the constant pressure of our digital lives, our sense of self can feel like it's cracking, like it's fracturing. That's exactly what we're going to unpack today. What happens when our identity is shattered, and how we can even begin to piece it back together. Just listen to this. This is a quote from an Iraq and Afghanistan war veteran. And in just a few words, he captures this huge, gaping chasm between two completely different worlds. On one side, the highly respected leader he was. On the other, feeling like a total newcomer in his own home. It's a really powerful, really personal look at what happens when a core piece of who you are just vanishes. So here's the game plan for this explainer. We're going to start by putting a name to this crisis of self. Then we'll dig into how big economic shocks and even our digital lives are feeding into it. After that, we'll challenge some of the old ideas about what recovery really means. And finally, we'll look at the major gaps we as a society really need to bridge. All right, let's get right into it. That feeling the veteran described, it's not just a vague sense of being lost. Nope, it's a recognized psychological phenomenon. It has a name, and honestly, understanding that name is the very first step. And that name is identity disruption. Now, what's really interesting here is the focus on adults. We tend to think of figuring out your identity as something you do in your teens, right? But this research shows that major life events can totally force us to rebuild our sense of self, long after we thought it was all locked in. It's like losing that consistent thread of who you are through time. And this, right here, just lays it out so clearly, using that veteran's own words. On the left, you see this powerful, crystal clear identity. It's built on competence, on leadership. And on the right, a completely different reality. One that feels, well, disempowering. That gap, that canyon between those two selves, that's where identity disruption lives. It's a heck of a disconnect. And get this is not some rare fringe issue. A study of veterans who were struggling with coming home found that nearly half, a staggering 49%, reported this profound sense of identity disruption. We're talking about a central challenge for a huge number of people trying to build a new life. So that's the initial idea of this crisis of self. Now for our second section, let's zoom out a bit, because losing a core part of your identity isn't just about returning from war. Big economic forces can be just as jarring, shattering the identity so many of us build around our work. This data from the National Bureau of Economic Research is pretty stark. It shows this direct, unmistakable link. For every single 1% increase in a county's unemployment rate, there's a significant, measurable jump in opioid-related emergency room visits. This is absolutely not a coincidence. It's a correlation that tells a deep, deep human story. Because losing a job is rarely, if ever, just about losing a paycheck. For so many people, it's losing your routine, your community, and maybe most importantly, your sense of purpose. And that void, that emptiness, it can lead to what some economists have grimly called deaths of despair. And this is all happening while the very foundation of work is shifting under our feet. OECD data shows this steady climb in domestic outsourcing. We're talking about cleaners, security guards, support staff, people who work at a company but aren't employed by that company. This whole trend toward less stable third-party work, it just weakens the connection between a worker and their workplace, making a solid professional identity that much harder to build and hang on to. Okay, so we've looked at military life and economic shocks. Now for our third section, let's talk about a more subtle threat to a stable sense of self, our always-on digital world, where the lines between all our different identities are getting seriously, dangerously blurred. A recent study breaks down this chain reaction, and it's pretty clear. It all starts with this toxic combination of high job stress and constant exposure to social media. That pairing cranks up our anxiety, which then directly fuels what the researchers call identity disturbance. It's a straight line from our screens to a fractured sense of self. The idea behind all this is called boundary theory, and you can think of it like this. We all naturally try to build walls to separate our work self from our home self, but things like remote work and social media, they're like wrecking balls to those walls. When your boss can ping you at 10 p.m. and your personal life is on display for your coworkers, those different identities just crash into each other, creating a ton of conflict and stress. So when your identity gets disrupted, it's not surprising that people sometimes turn to substances to cope. And that brings us to our fourth section, redefining recovery. Because our understanding of this whole process is often way too simple. Let's look at how the real experience really challenges our assumptions. Research into people's personal stories of addiction shows it is not a single story. Far from it. People describe their journeys in at least 4 distinct ways, from feeling like it was just a normal part of growing up to a super sudden, rapid downfall. This shows us there is no one-size-fits-all experience, which means there can't be a one-size-fits-all solution either. Now listen to this quote from a study. It's from someone who has been through treatment for substance use disorder. They're describing being able to have a beer in a controlled social way, what they call non-problematic use, but they choose not to because of their family. This introduces a level of nuance we just don't talk about enough. Which, of course, leads us to this really crucial question. For decades, the goal of treatment has been defined in very black and white terms, complete abstinence. But is that really the only way to define a successful outcome? Well, the research suggests we really need a much broader view. Instead of focusing only on abstinence, maybe a more effective measure of success is an overall improvement in someone's quality of life. Are their relationships more stable? Do they have a job? Have they learned better ways to cope? For a lot of people, these are the changes that actually matter. So, if we understand this whole identity disruption thing and we see the need for a more nuanced view of recovery, why aren't our systems better at handling it? Well, that brings us to our final section, the gaps. The gaps between research, treatment, and reality. And there are some pretty significant barriers. For one, there's a big cultural divide between the academics doing the research and the frontline providers doing the work. New findings can take years, literally years, to make it into practice. Community programs often just don't have the money to try new things. And, of course, there's the persistent stigma that treats addiction like a moral failing instead of a medical condition, which leads to policies that actually block effective treatments. And here's maybe the most critical piece of the puzzle. The voices of the people who actually need the treatment are so often missing from the conversation. I mean, think about it. In what other area of healthcare do the consumers have so little say in how their own care is designed and delivered? This is a huge reason why the system is so slow to change. And all of this leaves us with one final vital question. Our world isn't going to stop changing. Economic shifts, new technologies, unexpected life events, they're all going to keep challenging our sense of who we are. So the real task, the real challenge, is to figure out how we build identities that aren't rigid and brittle, but are flexible and resilient enough to withstand the shocks, both for ourselves and for the people around us.